recording. It says it's starting. So give me a second. It's still doing something. Yeah, there we go.
Thanks, Dr. Joy. Go ahead.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much. Right, good morning, everyone. So, as you probably overheard, my name's Dr. Rob Joy. I'm from the University of Southampton, and I'm an academic skills officer. So, I have a lovely job, which is mostly in the old days going around to schools in person, but otherwise it's now doing a bit of this sort of virtual delivery to do with the taught skills element of the EPQ. So you guys are all engaged with the EPQ at the moment, and I have a list somewhere in my inbox of your specific questions, but we can get to that if we have any time for questions and you've got specific stuff afterwards. I can talk to you then, but otherwise this is going to be a workshop about the writing process for your reports, and it's split into a handful of sections, as you'll see. So I'm going to talk about the actual writing, but with most emphasis on the planning and structure. And this isn't the one way to do it. There's plenty of ways to approach writing your EPQ, but this is obviously the way I'm going to suggest, because that's what I am about to do. But the way I'd suggest also, because it gives you, first of all, a framework that you can always fall back on. So the thing about writing is it can be incredibly hard and a long-winded process to be able to communicate really clearly on the page what it is that you're actually trying to say. What, trying to articulate your argument in a certain way can be very difficult. So the more detailed and structured and considered your plan is, the easier the writing stage is. And my emphasis is like mostly on the drafts in this, but the process from drafting to final thing is actually quite quick and easy, relatively speaking, because the way my plan or suggested plan goes, there's a lot less thought that goes into the actual writing stage. It's all in the planning stage. So you'll see what I mean, but there's a heavy emphasis on the planning stuff. And those are some of the things I'm going to go through. The planning and structure, paragraphs. So we're going to talk about something, Peel method, which you probably will have heard of. So when we get there, if you have, I'll go through that quickly to save you the tedious side of things. Then I'll talk about how I'd approach a first draft, and then how I separate out the different stages. So what would be writing a draft versus a second draft versus editing? Like, how do they differ? What do you look for in each separate stage? And then again, proofreading. How do you define the difference between the editing and the proofreading stages? I'll go into a bit of info on that. That's pretty much it, but it manages to span the whole 45 minutes, and hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. So in terms of planning and structure, if you do or follow this kind of method, then the planning will save you time. And that is, I think, probably one of the key things for the EPQ, is that you're doing it alongside your other studies. It's an additional, you don't have necessarily as much time every week as you do for every other subject you're doing. So being well prepared and planning your essay quite thoroughly will actually save you a lot of time. It means you can dedicate short chunks of time to it and, actually crack on and produce good work. It will also make the writing easier. So I've already mentioned that, how that's a very difficult aspect of actually putting the essay together, getting it into this formal style, this academic kind of style, where you want to incorporate your evidence. You need to present it in a certain way to make it convincing, to make your argument quite strong and robust. And also you have to consider the people reading are probably less expert in the area you're writing on than you are. So you will know more than them, and that kind of makes it almost more important that you express things clearly so anyone can read your work and understand the points you're trying to make. And good planning will also reduce the editing needed. So we'll see how that works in action a bit later, but ultimately, if you have a structure and you think about how to do self-contained paragraphs, you can chop and change and move them about without impacting all other bits in your argument, in your essay. Whereas if you have written as you've gone and just gone with a big flow, you're going to be potentially referencing past stuff, future stuff that you're going to talk about. Paragraphs aren't self-contained points necessarily, so the reader's mind will be going around all over the place, looking back a page or two in your essay. When you talk about something you talk about later, they might be turning over the page to find out. With your good planning, you can keep everything self-contained, maybe in sections. Again, it's kind of whatever supports your work will be best. But it will be a lot more of a coherent read for the reader and less effort for you to edit. So we'll talk about separating your essay out into sections, and there are 3 obvious sections that I'm going to talk about. But I will chat a bit about the overall structure, so the beginning, the middle, and the end, the rough word allocation for these sections of the essay, and then the microstructure. Does anyone know, or can anyone guess what I mean by microstructure? Oh, it's also very difficult to know if you're talking or if I just can't hear you. So you might have to get someone to type no if nobody's talking. I really, really faintly heard you say, "Can you hear me?" That was it. So if no one knows, I will carry on and explain. So basically, we'll go into not just the how much in the sections of each essay, but thinking about then how much you dedicate to each point. I'll look, like I said, at the breakdown of the paragraph, and if there's anyone interested, we can talk about even sentences. But all of those things are the microstructure, the tiny components that, even down to word choice, individual word choice, we will try and drill down into. Obviously, I'm not going to be massively specific. Everyone's project is different, but I'll try and touch on these things. So for the more macro structure, you would normally have these 3 sections, which I would suspect you're all familiar with already. An introduction, main body of your essay, and then the conclusion, where you do different things in each section. But it's important to keep in mind what you do specifically in the intro really can set out the expectations of the reader. It's a bit like at the start of this workshop, I had the overview slide where I just said, I'm going to do the writing, the drafting, first draft planning, editing, and then proofreading. It doesn't tell you a lot, but it gives you, you know what to expect. After I've done the writing and drafting stuff, I'm going to move on to editing. That's coming. Even if you've forgotten it by then, at least you did know. So that's the same with your intro in the essay. You want to be telling people what you're about to argue. So very specifically flagging up the question you're answering. What is this? What area are you looking at? What's the topic? What is the question, the problem you are solving? And then telling them what the actual answer is as well. That's quite important. Then think about the main body. That's where you'll state all the claims, you'll provide all the evidence for your argument, and then your conclusion is just a summary where you'll be reiterating your main findings, the main argument, what's the key things you want the reader to take away. So those are the bits of content that you have. So a really quick question, which of those, if you had the chance, which you do, which would you write first and why? Or what order would you write them in, thinking about what they take? Someone might have to type in the chat, I'm afraid. But yeah, what order do you think you'd write the intro, main body, conclusion?
That's what you think you would write? They said intro, main body, that's the order you've just said.
Cool, thank you very much. So I will, luckily I don't know who said that, I'm not going to pick on anybody, but that's what everybody always says, interestingly. And it makes complete sense in a flow way, beginning, middle, end. You start at the beginning, you work through to the end. However, typically I would write the main body first. So the reason that I would do that, and I'd write the introduction last, actually. So even after the conclusion, then I would go back and do the introduction. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So here we go. Here's a great animation that will show you those things. But the reasons for that are that generally you've hopefully had a look through all your evidence, you've collected your sources. There might be instances where you're planning and you then realize you need a bit more evidence, or you remember another thing you looked at that you haven't really properly read yet, and so you'll go back and you'll add evidence. That's fine, and everyone does that. But the problem with writing your introduction first is if you write that and you say, here's what I'm answering, here is the answer, and then you start going through the main body of your work and you're presenting point after point after point in your evidence, and you're showing some primary sources or some secondary sources that back up what you'll say and collectively provide the evidence for that point. If, as you're going, you suddenly realize, well, that's not 100% actually what that point is. If what you wrote in your notes about one piece of evidence, when you take, say, 6 sources and combine them, it might be slightly more nuanced. It might not just be a binary yes or no, or it was this reason or it was that reason. There might be a bit more. If you've written your introduction and you've already been because you want to be quite confident in your introduction, but if you've written that and you've said, well, here's what I'm saying, and then the reader goes on, they look at the main body, and there's a couple of points you've made in your essay that don't quite match what you say in your introduction, at the end, you're going to have to go back, rewrite the whole intro again. So the reason I do the introduction last is because you can present all your evidence, you can go over it a few times. Unfortunately, you're going to have to read your own work several times, but you'll have to go through. When you summarize in your conclusion, then that's what I'm arguing. Your conclusion should be a summary of the main body of of how the evidence supports your argument. Then I would go back and do your introduction. So at that point, you know precisely what it is you're saying in the essay, the exact journey that the reader is going to go on. Almost paragraph to paragraph, what point they're going to get before another point or after, how that's going to impact how they understand your argument. And so then you know what you're dealing with. You can then in the introduction talk about those kinds of things. So, you can say, first, this essay will look at this, then we will move on to look at that. And, you build your argument sentence by sentence in the introduction because it just says what's going to happen. If you try and do that before you've written, and then you start chopping and changing, moving paragraphs up and down, you'll have to go back to the intro, redo that as well. So it's I think generally maybe a time-saving method, but also another reason is finding your own writing style. Like that can take a long time. Some of you might not even find it during the process of the EPQ. But people settle into this kind of rhythm that they're happy with in terms of writing more formal academic work, something that suits them and how they, like a mixture between how they'd express themselves day to day and how they would write a formal essay. You'll find your own style. If you write the introduction at the very start, that's the first thing you've written. By the time you've got to the conclusion, you're 5,000 words in, let's say, if you're doing the report, you'll have settled into a way that you like to write, a way you find comfortable, a way you can sort of see this is how I express myself on the page. And the introduction is going to be the least representative of that because it was done right at the start. So if you're, in theory, everything you write, you'll be getting a little bit more confident with your style, with your understanding of the arguments. So it might look like the confidence builds up throughout your essay. And then the introduction, however, is the first thing you wrote. It might be the less precise, it might be a bit uncertain, it might not know what's coming next, so it's going to be even more imprecise, even less certain. Your style isn't going to be quite the same. Whereas if you go back and write it as the final thing, it means when the reader starts, the essay begins, and you've got this confident writing style that you can see actually is carried throughout the essay. It brings it all together and makes it a slightly more coherent piece as a whole. So those are, I think, the 2 reasons why I would do the introduction last. But also, I guess the final thing is just an anecdotal part of my own experience, which was exactly this scenario, really, in my PhD. Writing the introduction first, thinking this is how to, I can sort of write out, and it broadly sketches out what my argument is, and then I write the main thesis based on the evidence, and that, I'll have the intro already done. By the time I got to the end of the main thesis with lots and lots of evidence, I realized that what I was arguing was not what I'd written in my introduction. And that was, I mean, for you, the introduction is going to be a few hundred words. It was, I think, like 7,000 words for me. So I had to just scrap it and write 7,000 words again. And in terms of, you applying this to future projects, that's not a good position to be in. It's a very stressful position. So anything that you can do to avoid that is probably worth it. So I'll start talking a bit about the main body of the essay and what it should include. And I think this will be stuff that you probably know already, or even if you don't consciously know it, you kind of do know it really. But in terms of word length, if you're doing the 5,000 word report, the main body should be 3,000 to 4,000 words, let's say. There's obviously a little bit of room either way for you to do what you want, increase or decrease on that number. Different people's arguments and topics will require a different amount of evidence, different sizes of introductions and conclusions. Sometimes your introduction, if you're doing something very heavy science-based or where there's a lot of technical language going on, your introduction might have to be quite big because you'll need to cover for the reader what do all these things mean that they're going to be, looking at. They don't know, necessarily all of the language you're using. If it's something where everyone's going to know what you're talking about in terms of any weird terminology you're using, or there's no kind of outlandish bits of evidence. I don't mean outlandish in terms of their ideas, but kind of sources that are very non-traditional that you really have to explain what they are to readers. Your introduction can be short, your main body can be bigger, but 3,000 to 4,000 words is probably the norm. It's a chance to develop your arguments using evidence. I think, you know this again. It's a chance to explain. So that's the key thing. The explanation and the analysis is what the examiners are looking for. And you have to some extent, be a bit cynical. This is this is a great project for you to get stuck into and explore something you're really interested in. But somebody's marking it at the end of the day, and you will have to, comply with the objectives that, each section of the EPQ lays out. So using evidence, explaining and analysing, rather than just describing what the evidence is, that's key to building your argument, to well expressing your argument, and to driving it along within the essay as well. So demonstrate your findings, another thing you can do in the main body. And this will be, examples. You can maybe choose some case studies if you've got particular like surveys or data sets or experiments or questionnaires or just collections of primary material or secondary material, but bring in, a set of something to try and demonstrate why what you're saying is true. Again, using the evidence, using analysis. And planning for your main body, breaking your main body into several subsections can sometimes be handy. It's not something that necessarily is going to suit every EPQ, and this is why these are really difficult too. Your excuse me, particular report is going to be driven by your evidence. So every one of your reports is going to be slightly different. And there's a few ways to structure, well, there's probably an infinite number of ways, but a few ways I'd sort of talk about generally to structure the main body of your EPQ, which I'll go through now. So these are things to keep in mind. One of these might strike a chord with you. You might see this and go, oh, that's going to fit because I'm doing, let's say someone's doing a historical topic and you're just doing a narrative. You're going through from the furthest away date to the closest one, looking at a topic. That's nice. Let's say nice and easy. You still need the evidence, but in terms of thinking about the structure, okay, just chronological. You might choose to do it by theme. Then you're getting into a kind of different area where you're thinking, well, within the themes, do I go chronologically or do I just pick one example from a different time period? How might that work? So these are a few ideas to start you thinking about planning. So in your subsections, I would suggest most of you will probably start with a bit of a literature review, even if it's only a tiny bit. So does anyone know what a literature review is? I'm afraid you'll have to type again, but what's a literature review? Oh, excellent. Yeah, it is exactly that. So in a mildly patronizing way, it's a review of the literature, but it's exactly where you reflect on your sources. So you'll have your source base of material, and you will go through what it is you're using, particularly with respect to the typing. Oh, excellent. Thank you. So yeah, typing up sources, reflecting on their usefulness, talking about as well when it comes to your secondary material, so the material written by other academics, other authors, data collected by other people that you're using, who is saying what as well. So it's thinking about the usefulness of your sources, reflecting on them. That is probably a good way of putting it. But who's saying what? So if you're I'll use a really broad example that is too broad for an EPQ, but if you're just tackling climate change, that's that. If you're doing it globally, which is a massive project, obviously, but let's imagine this is a bigger piece of work, you would, in your literature review, go through, right, well, these are the academics working on the agricultural sector and its impact on the climate and environment, and this person says dairy farms are the worst, and this person says this particular crop is the worst. So you've just given a real brief summary, like 3 sentences, I did that in, of 2 people that you would use in your argument that are, slightly different points. One's about the animal side, one's about the crop side, but you're giving that evidence and telling the reader who's working on those things. So then you might say, oh, these people are working on ocean pollution, and they all agree that microplastics are dreadful for ocean life. So that's really obvious, not a good example. We all know that anyway. But if you're using that as evidence, your literature review is at the start of your main body. It's where you talk about what are the main academics that you're looking at talking about. So then you would go on to provide your own primary evidence, pushing forward. So here we go, explaining, justifying your methodology. So the literature review talks about who's doing what. Then you could move on to a methodology section or a sources section if you're using primary material, where you even really briefly, this might just be 2 sentences. You say, oh, I'm using, like let's say you're doing a thing about COVID. I'm using official figures from the UK government website and the Office for National Statistics. I'm not looking at stuff produced by NHS England. Or I'm looking at NHS England, Scotland and Wales figures. I'm not looking at Northern Ireland. But talking about what sources you're using. If there's a particular reason why you're going to use a particular data set or a set of sources, like if they're historical things, if they're photographs or something, that's the place to talk about it and justify why you're using them. So you have to think about, why are these sources, why are these bits of evidence, the right bits of evidence to use to make the argument I'm making. Obviously, they may have informed or they will inform your argument. You'll have read this stuff and that might be formed your opinions. But why are they the right piece of evidence to be using? So having a paragraph, I say a section, but it doesn't have to be, thousands and thousands of words. It can be a paragraph where you just explain why this is what I'm using. The review goes over what it says. Then you explain or justify why it's correct, why the methodology you're using. Then you can move on to an analysis. So that would be a bigger section, and that will be where maybe you bring up pieces of evidence or several pieces at a time. So these are the bits that support this argument, and you'd analyse them. Is it about them that does support your argument? So some examples. That's where you might put some choice quotes from interviews, newspaper articles, if you're doing anything that's like looking at that kind of thing, public opinion, and you'll analyse that material. And so it's all about drawing out the meaning as it pertains to the questioning or answering. And then you might have a discussion section. So that's, again, you've done the analysis, and now you discuss. You'll now be going, what does all this mean? Right, I've told you this data set, can tell us how much time in Wales had COVID versus in Scotland, and I've told you what different measures they had in place for public health. Then you do the discussion. You say, all right, well, why do they have the differences, and what does that impact on, on the public, or the perception of COVID prevalence, perhaps in those regions? That's what we're talking about. So your discussion section is a chance to then start talking about them. Now, this example, you might have come across in academic papers, but it's very often more science-based academic papers might have this. Possibly social science-based academic papers would have this kind of approach where they'll break it down into sections. You might see more in humanities ones where you just kind of an introduction, a literature review, and then they crack on with the whole rest of it. So it's not a hard and fast do this, but it's one way of approaching things where, you know, if you can pick a version you want to think about, tweak it to your needs, again, it's a thing you can fall back on as you go forward with your writing. So another version might start with a literature review, and it might simply go through example 1, supporting an argument, example 2, supporting your argument, example 3, and then you may have only 3, you may have 10, and you've got to give much less space, only a few hundred words each. But that's a completely valid way to go through it. If you've got 3, 4, 5 case studies that all support the argument you're making. And you'll notice there I've mentioned discussing counter. So I think I've got a time on balance for a while, but thinking about evidence. If you're one of the lucky people and all the research you've done and everything you can find supports your argument, then definitely write that somewhere. You know, you've looked for more sources, you've looked at other authors, you looked for authors in the past, perhaps you've looked for evidence, but everything you find suggests including. Make sure you mention that. If, on the other hand, you've got a few academics, a few people, perhaps some angry blog writers who disagree with what it is that you're saying, if you've got evidence that can dismiss their claims, then do bring them into your essay, bring them into your work, and kind of, you know, you can have an example with the evidence you've got supporting it, and then turn to them and say, oh, there are some people who disagree with this. Here's what they say. Here's why I think it's not valid, and then that's what you know bring in be a lot more footnotes, make citations going on your kind of reference evidence that dismisses the claim. Think also when you're bringing in contrary evidence about the so there's no need if you'll notice, but like the majority of scientists think climate change is a real thing. The majority of people think it's a real thing. But there's this tiny minority that don't. You don't need to give 50% of your essay over to the opposing view just because there's a few of them. If it was 50-50 in the scientific community about climate change, then maybe you would give over half of it. But you definitely don't need to give over half. It's just a tiny, tiny proportion of people. So addressing counterclaims, dismissing them if you can provide the evidence, and giving it a reasonable space over to them is worth also including somewhere in your essay. Another way that might work more with artifacts, so they're shorter reports, as you've probably seen at the bottom, it's 1,000 to 1,500 words. But for those artifact reports you want to think about, discussion with your audience, the purpose of your final artifact, the purpose being what was it meant to do, what was it meant to feel or think, or how are they emotionally supposed to respond to it, and then the more practical side of things, maybe the materials used and the influences, whether that's influences that you have personally anyway or from your research, or whether it's influences in that you thought about an artifact as it maybe from like a client brief you would have been commissioned, let's say, to do a certain project. What did the client tell you to think about influencing, where do they want these ideas from? And again, you may well have written a client brief for that, so it's something you have control over. I'm going to go very quickly through this, not well on the artifact stuff, but I'm very happy to answer. So I'll talk also about the contribution effect. That's about 500 to 700 words. It's a place to summarize things and reiterate the main argument. So none of this would be particularly new info to you. I think you'll have all done a conclusion at some point. And it is a summary. It doesn't have to be a point summary. It can just be a summing up. Sometimes conclusions feel incredibly brief, but occasionally that does work. So go with what you think helps best work for you. Have you got a very long, complicated argument? If yes, trying to sum it up in a paragraph or two might be necessary and helpful. It's a very clear argument, very easy to understand, and like you're just using, say, 3 big examples. Summing them up is going to be very easy and could be done in a sentence or two. So it's going to be different again based on your question, based on your evidence. But don't introduce new evidence to your conclusion. If you have this happens, I think, often because people want to make a big impression at the end. They want to kind of have this, like, here's the killer thing that, this seals the deal and really makes my argument valid. If you've got a bit of evidence you're willing to bring in the conclusion, stop, go back and find out where it fits into your argument and make a big deal of it there. The conclusion should be a section that doesn't bring anything new. Whoever's reading it shouldn't need to look anything up to start digging around in your footnotes to understand what you're talking about. It should just be a summary of what you've already talked about. Make sure the conclusion answers the question. That's, I'm sure, a chronic tip that you're given in all essays, exams. Answer the question, but make sure that you haven't. And this is the normal thing that happens, isn't that you don't answer the question or that question. It's that people answer a very slightly different question often without really thinking about it. So sometimes there's those to what extent questions, and you don't really touch on extent. You come up with a categorical answer. I'm not saying everyone's doing this or not, but this is just an example of something that can happen. So make sure when you're writing your conclusion, you are thinking, right, what is the exact way I've worded this question? Am I answering it? How am I referring back to the main body of my argument to summarize things in which, you read it, the reader knows the answer to the question at the top of the page. Keep relating stuff back. And a thing that can push you a tiny bit further in terms of the marks, in terms of your own ability as well, and this is really helpful, I think, going forward. Not just thinking about possibly university or anything, but the wider workplace, finding gaps in knowledge and filling them, or getting the material to fill them. You've become quite good, I imagine, at you know your topic. You're trying to find evidence for it. You've probably got a grip on some websites that have been helpful, others maybe less so, but there's a bit of info on there for you. So in the future, how can your research be used? What is it that it's helping researchers understand now? So this might feel quite abstract, but it's a thing that sets you or can set you slightly apart from other EPQ students. Having an awareness of the field. So you guys have had a look through a load of evidence. You've come up with an argument, or you're coming up with an argument to plan your essay at the moment. That means, like the way I like to think about it is, in terms of England, the UK, possibly further afield, you're probably the only person who is answering that question using those pieces of evidence. So you are quite an expert on this, even if you don't see yourself as that. And if you haven't got a fully formed argument yet, carry on reading, refine things. You will be becoming an expert on this. So you then can see in some of the literature or in answering your question, what is it that people aren't talking about? You'll be able to find, if there's something I can't find evidence for this particular point I want to make, and you've had a look around beyond what you've collected, you've downloaded a few other things or looked online elsewhere for more sources, you can't find an answer still, then flag things like that up in your conclusion. And you can say, that I've answered this question, here's the answer, this is what it means. This can be helpful because researchers haven't really looked at whatever it might be. And my work can help further their understanding. So knowing how you fit in is quite important. Not for just achieving, getting the essay done and completing the EQ, but for showing you've got a bit of a wider knowledge and understanding of the academic field. Would be really helpful. And then the intro, which we've talked about a bit. It's a place where you provide some context for your work. So I've already mentioned a little bit of background info if it's necessary. If you are talking about something that everybody knows about, I can't think that'll be, not everybody knows about everything, but giving some sort of context as to what you're looking at. What you are not studying is one of the interesting lines there. So it doesn't mean, in a really flippant way, or studying something to do with public opinion on football. You don't have to then say, I'm not thinking about public opinion on rugby or public opinion on tennis. That's not needed. But if you're saying I'm looking at public opinion on football, you might want to be more specific and say, well, I'm looking just at the championship. I'm not looking at other leagues, or I'm only looking at a certain cup. I'm not looking at other things. So it's a way of just defining or helping the reader know, right, okay, well, when they talk about this, they don't mean anything to do with this attached bit of topic where we're very specifically looking at X. So the intro is a good place to do that, just flagging that stuff, giving that bit of background reading. I've already mentioned the terminology, any awkward, weird names, if you're doing something certainly science or chemistry based and you've got some weird chemical names or anything like that, or processes perhaps that the average reader is not going to be familiar with. Giving a quick explanation of that is going to be very helpful for them so they can just crack straight onto the essay and they'll know what you're talking about. And then your approach. So that's like your methodology I mentioned already in one of the earlier structure examples for the main body. How are you answering the question? So are you looking at public opinion on, let's say, the structure of the FA? I don't know what public opinion is going to be on that. People have got strong thoughts one way or the other. But if you're looking at that, how are you answering that? Have you done questionnaires? Have you just looked at existing data sets? Have you just read newspaper articles to kind of assess what people think? Have you gone out and interviewed people? Are they just regular people on the street, so to speak, friends, relatives, whatever? Or are they people who work for the Football Association? So how have you decided to approach answering that question? What's the kind of evidence base that you've used? And then make sure at some point in your introduction, you clearly state what it is, what you're doing, what you're answering, and the answer. So flagging up, even at you'll see stuff that opens very, very explicitly with like this essay will explore, and then it basically states the question. And then sometimes in academic work, sometimes it very quickly says like we conclude, or I conclude, or this concludes. That this is the answer, and then the introduction will follow. So sometimes it flags it right at the start. Sometimes it's buried within the introduction. It doesn't really matter where you put it, but do include it. That's the key thing. Make sure you're being very explicit with your reader and saying, here's what I'm setting out to answer. Here's the answer. Then you move on after you've talked about the terminology, your approach, any evidence that's of note. You move on to the main body then. But that's the kind of stuff you should put in the introduction. Setting out what are they about to read? What's the reader about to read? So always try and think about your reader. So here's something for you to do for a second. But basically, so don't worry about writing, intro, main body, conclusion. If you just have somewhere main body written, but try and think of as many key points. Like, so how many points are there to argue? So as many key arguments. You've got 15 points to make, sort of fallbacks by different bits of evidence, or are you it's case studies that you're going to be sort of applying? Maybe you've only got 3 or 4. Try and just list those 3 or 4. I appreciate different people maybe at slightly different stages with this, or quite further, in which case might be easy. But I'm just going to give you a minute to try and get as many down. The only reason is to just get your mind thinking about how you're going to present your points. So I'll give you a minute to write as many sort of sections within your main body section as you can. Okay, that is about a minute. Thanks for doing that. Again, this is something that might be helpful in terms of you're going to have a list, you're going to be starting to think about what are the things I actually want to get across to my audience, and what are the main points I'd like to communicate, the main arguments. So this will feed into the next stage of making a plan. This is one method to do it, and different people work differently. But let's say you've got those main points, and you've had a bit more of a think about all of the elements that make up your main body. So as opposed to just that 1 minute, 10 seconds thinking about them, you've had a few hours a day, whatever it is, to go over your evidence and work out, okay, here's all the key points. One thing I do, I'm more of a list person, so I tend to, like, this talks about post-it notes, and I don't really get on with that way of working, but some people it really works for, and I see the value in this sense. But if you can do a branched list, then you're fine as well. But listing your key points, and then for each key point, putting it on a post-it note, or just writing a list again. But the post-it note thing, you can start to move them around, obviously. You can start to vary the order of your paragraphs. So that's when it becomes a lot easier to start visualizing the essay and thinking about, okay, well, if I talk about these three things first, that makes the argument my fourth element. It sets up the context for it. Whereas if I put that fourth thing, I was to put that first, the reader wouldn't really know what basis for that is, because I haven't gone into other pieces of evidence. Thinking about it, it's very hard to do, like, examples in an abstract way, but thinking about how to provide a logical flow that the reader can follow. So that's quite helpful, firstly, for thinking about the points, but thinking about the evidence. The handy side of the post-it note here is then, if you've got each point on a post-it note, one good thing to think about to narrow down again your structure and your planning thing, turn it over, and whatever the point is, just write down all the bits of evidence that you can support it. And what this eventually turns into is a stack of post-it notes you can move about, or a list that you can expand upon and contract as you will. But if you think about each post-it note as one paragraph, you're doing a lot of the work there by not actually putting much effort in. You've got a post-it note with a point on it, and on the back you've got, say, 5 sources. So to make that point, it's one paragraph. That's the point you're making. This is the evidence you're using. That's already the content of the paragraph covered. It's not written yet, but then it's just a matter of shifting it about to find the correct order. That's when you think about logic, how sensitive your flow is, and is it sensible to group the points like you are? So the post-it idea, the list idea can help you with that. If you're, so that can work in several ways. You're building the argument chunk by chunk. Is it better to look at types of evidence first? So let's say you're doing something historical and you're looking at, like, 19th century imperial Britain cartoons, and like how is empire presented to the public through cartoons. Do you want to look at all the kind of literary publications first that the working classes wouldn't have been reading, so you can see what the elites in society are kind of seeing through this? And then you want to move on to the more working class publications and daily newspapers and see what normal people are looking at. So does that make sense? Or does it make sense in terms of what the outcome is? So, these people all disliked it, these people were pro-empire. Is it more sensible to do that? So thinking about how you group stuff. Again, if you've got stuff written down point by point, just shifting post-it notes around makes that very easy. So a second thing then, for each point that you've just made, try and come up with as many, so it says there, case studies, examples, themes, but from each point you've made, branch off and either list all the bits of evidence you've got, or all the documents that support this, all of the authors who are in agreement with your point, or if it's a case study you've done, what are the primary bits of evidence you're using to talk about this case study? If it's a particular example of something, what are the sources you're using to prove this example? So it's only a thing off the top of your head, and I'm probably just going to give you 1 minute to do it, but it's This sort of thing is what you can do then to further making that plan. So, you know, ultimately your points will all be expanding till they fill a few pages, and then you can start reordering. But I'll give you another minute now to just come up with all the bits of evidence, expand that plan to the main body of your essay plan. Okay, so that is about a minute, and I can see a handful of you are writing, so that's great. I know this may be of, you know, more or less limited value depending where you are, how much research you've already done, and how many notes you've already taken and stuff, and how much, you know, you keep it at the front of your mind. Some people, it's committed to paper so they can go back and look at it and they don't have to keep it in their head. That's fine as well. But this is just, you know, getting your, I suppose, writing creative juices flowing in that sense when it comes to thinking about how to do your plan, how to fill in gaps. So, oh, there's typing happening. I'm going to really quickly go through, thank you, really quickly go through the paragraph structure. So has anyone, just a show of hands, have you heard of the PEAL method? P-E-A-L or P-E-E-L? Yes, okay. Then all I'm going to say then, so we can get the most out of these next 7 minutes, is try and follow it. It is, as you know, as I'm desperately clicking to go through, and it's not coming up on my slides, but point, evidence, analysis, and link. It's not going to come up. There we go. So one of the examples I've got, I'll send these slides through so you can have a look at them, but it is really beneficial to thinking about structuring your essay. And like I said at the start, if you know that you're going to follow this sort of approach, it's a fallback. It means the post-it note is all of the first line, excuse me, and the blue section, the sort of yellowy, green and blue. The post-it note covers that. You know the point that you're making and you know the evidence. So although you haven't written the long form version of every paragraph in your plan so far, if you've just put what's the main point you're making, what's the bits of evidence you're going to use for it, that's half of each paragraph already planned. And that's why this can be a really helpful method to fall back on, because the actual writing process does become a lot easier. So that's just one example. Then I have another example from my thesis. You can read them at another point. And I do a different thing with the link line each time. So that could link back to the question, or it can link to the next section. And I've got an example of each in this PowerPoint. So you can have a look at those in your own time if you desire. I will go straight then, just for the sake of time, to the drafting section. But essentially, when you're doing your paragraphs, just make sure every piece of evidence you use supports your argument. And if there's a lot of evidence that supports it, don't be afraid of a long paragraph. Don't think this is getting, you know, nearly a page in length. If it's all around the same point, then that's fine. That's valid. So then the drafting stage, there's actually only one slide on the whole drafting stage. Because if you have a plan like this, the drafting stage is just filling in the gaps. It's basically expanding out every single bullet point you had to include those bits of evidence, and then to add to your, add your analysis in. But you go through each point and just get words on the page. And I would say at the drafting stage, I would just sit there and type, just bash out words and get content down. You can think about formalizing it. You can think about changing words. You can think about better expressing yourself in subsequent drafts and then the final editing proofreading stages. But getting material down onto the page. Then your second draft, your third draft, that's when you start going through and thinking, okay, I've got, banged out the evidence, I've talked about the point, I can improve my analysis on this bit. But do I answer the question in this paragraph? Am I actually addressing the question? You can be a bit more precise. And I would say you'll probably need 3 drafts through. So, you do the plan, you do a first draft, and at least 2 other full passes in the drafting till you're happy with the words and the structure of your argument. So there aren't many tips to give there. There's not much help I can give other than if you stick to your plan and you do think about each point or each post-it note as a paragraph, transfer that into the draft. It will mean that the editing, you can cut, paste the paragraph further down. It still will make sense as its own paragraph, and hopefully you can then just improve and refine the flow. So then we would move on to editing. It wouldn't be as swift as the presentation. Drafting still takes a long time because getting the words down is timely. But it should be an easy process following your plan. So the editing is where you can then think about very specific word choice. Go through and really be self-critical and think about, can I shorten that sentence down? It's also a good place if you're drafting and you're on 6,000-7,000 words. Editing is where you're then cutting and choosing what to cut. Before you just cut big sections, big chunks, if it's all relevant to your argument, you want to think about how to pare it down instead, how to be more concise. So go through and think about, can I rephrase that sentence to be shorter and say the same thing? Do I need to be overly technical here, or can I actually just reference the source and then just use my analysis? Can I remove some description perhaps from early stages of the argument if you think you may be over describing sources and not analysing them enough? Thinking about impactful sentence lengths as well. So short sentences have greater impact. That's going to maybe be helpful if you're closing a paragraph, you're making a really important point, you're writing your conclusion, you want to hammer home your point, kind of working out how you can phrase things in short, insightful sentences will have a greater impact on the reader. Editing is also where you can add in something called signposting. So this isn't always necessary, but it's very nice for the reader journey, if you like. It's much like the intro slide at the start of this workshop. It's a bit like the introduction, but telling the reader exactly what you're going to do. So some examples there, first I will investigate, and you'll tell them what you'll look at first. Then we will move on to look at, and you will expressly say what it is you'll be moving on to look at. So using these kinds of signposts can be really helpful just for giving the reader a bit of confidence in knowing where the argument's going to go. It also keeps you on track. So once you've set your structure, you can go back and go, right, I talk about that. Okay, that's all I need to do in the intro. So first we're going to look at these things, then that. It makes sure everything in the essay kind of mirrors itself. You don't suddenly say in the intro, I'm going to do it in this order, and then the main body is something different. So adding in a bit of signposting, if you have the words, is really helpful. And then removing the weasel words, let's say. So anything we are talking about, or it could be suggested that some people believe that kind of thing. If some people believe something, then try and give some sort of, not a number, but most scientists, or is it most of the public, or only 60%, so a bit over half, that kind of thing. Try and be precise and avoid just a bit of fence-sitting language of like, oh, it might be said that. If you've got stuff that backs up your examples, use that. So that's the editing process. Again, only oh no, the bell's gone. Well, I only had one slide left for the proofreading, so I'll really quickly blurt it out in case you can still hear me and it's okay to carry on for like 15 seconds. But basically, cool. I'll be as quick as I can. I really don't want to take up too much of your time in this sense. So proofreading, checking for all the stuff you think, spelling, punctuation, grammar. The main thing about proofreading that I would recommend, print your work out, but before you do, change the font and change the font size. That's my 2 tips for proofreading. Your brain processes it in a different way because all the words have moved around. They're not the same as they were on the screen. They're not the same as they were on other drafts. So it becomes fresh for you to look at, and you'll pick up on more of your mistakes. So be harsh on yourself in that sense, but yeah, change the font size, print it out, and you'll be able to look at it with fresh eyes and then go and be really thorough in terms of picking up all the little mistakes. That actually is the end. So thank you very much. I'm sorry to have overrun by a minute or so, and all the best with your EPQ projects. No worries. Okay, well, I still can't hear you, but I'm going to stop the recording, and hopefully it's going to be accessible to everyone. And yeah, thanks very much. Have a good rest of your day.